Welcome to another round with the Pacific Research Institute. PRI is a free market think tank headquartered in San Francisco. I'm your host, Rowena Itchon. Are you looking for a great place to enjoy a glass of wine along the Orange County coast? Stay tuned to hear our guest recommendations for the best places in OC. On this episode of Another Round, we're talking about elections in California. You always hear about international observers going to foreign countries to observe their elections and ensure that they're fair. With so many new laws enacted in Sacramento in recent years, it may be time to call international observers to watch California's elections. PRI's Director of Communications, Tim Anaya, recently talked with Orange County Assemblyman Matthew Harper. Assemblyman Harper is a lifelong political activist and is a vice chair of the Assembly Elections and Redistricting Committee. They talked about recently enacted California laws that have upended fair elections in California. They also discussed his bill to provide more transparency to voters when bond measures are on the ballot. Best of all, they talked about the upcoming USC football season and the great opportunity for the Trojans to make the college football playoff this year. In Last Call, we'll be joined by PRI's Lance Izumi, and we'll give all our thoughts on what Assemblyman Harper had to say. Assemblyman Harper talked with Tim in his office at the state capitol in Sacramento.
Well, Assemblyman Matthew Harper, thank you for joining us on Another Round with PRI.
Good to be here.
So this is exciting for me, that we've known one another, probably 20 years. And we started out together as, I remember we were walking trailer parks in Santa Maria, knocking on doors for whoever was running back then.
Ordinaro is who it was, yeah.
So you've kind of developed a reputation in Sacramento, kind of Mr. Campaigns and Elections. If anybody looks at your Facebook page, they see you have your visits to all the different state capitals. And last year you made news when you were knocking on doors in the Iowa caucuses, and you've literally campaigned all over the state. So tell us, I guess, why has activism been so important to you throughout your career, and how does it shape your approach to serving in the Assembly?
Well, it's one thing to be able to participate in your democracy by voting, but it's a whole nother thing to be able to participate. It doesn't take someone with big money or who can write big check to be influential in politics. All it takes is time, effort, and focus. And I've been involved in volunteer organizations to recruit other volunteers, but I've been a volunteer myself. And you're right. The thing that's the most influential that I've found is that good old door-to-door campaigning and being able to connect with people one-on-one using a list of voters in the neighborhood and knocking on their doors. Some people do it by phone banking. Some people do it in other ways. But nevertheless, that one-to-one personal communication, even in this age of the internet, is still the most valuable.
You sit in the unenviable position as vice chair of the Assembly Elections and Redistricting Committee, and I found over the years, when I worked in the legislature, we, tried to gin up press interest on so many of these bad bills that came through over the years. Yet, whenever you kind of talk about the elections process, often you see people's eyes start to glaze over. But it really is so important. And these changes usually are some of the most important bills debated each year. So make your case. Why should your constituents and people across California pay more attention to these elections changes that are going through?
Well, one thing that does tend to happen is that the party in power will often make the rules to the advantage of themselves. And that's been the case here in the state of California. The legislature's been under the 100% control of Democrats since the mid-1990s. It's so out of balance now that there's actually a supermajority in both the state Senate as well as the state Assembly. And that's come out when it comes to elections rules. And little by little, every session has a, quote, reform, which tends to benefit that majority that's currently in power. As I said, it's paid in dividends.
Redistricting, it's hard to believe, but redistricting is just around the corner. Once again, just after the 2020 census, California will be redrawing the legislative and congressional district lines. And looking ahead, what do you think California's next redistricting will look like, and what are some of the concerns you have entering the process?
Well, I think there's two big potential scenarios. And let's keep in mind that redistricting is no longer in the hands of the state legislature. That was a reform that was made during the past decade that made it so it's actually a commission, an independent commission, if you will. But even though it's an independent commission that does have both Republicans, Democrats, and also declined to state members on it, it is built in to be influenced. And so people who participate in the testimony help frame the issues for that commission. Now, the commission could easily blow up the lines that are currently held and be completely different in the next cycle, or they could say, because the previous commission put together the lines independently, that those would be maybe changed a little bit. I will say that these lines that we currently have that were adopted by the previous commission were very different, especially in my local county of Orange County. There was only one district that was similar to what it was before, and I will say that that one district is the district which is majority Democrat and would reliably elect a Democrat. It's the 69th, and that's the first one that they drew, but it's in large part because people got out and gave testimony that was consistent. A lot of people gave out consistent testimony asking for that district, and the commission actually put it together. So I think that your lines, congressional, state Senate, state assembly, as well as the Board of Equalization that are all drawn by the commission, they could be very similar or they could be radically different.
There have been many bills enacted in recent years that really have made what was, most observers would agree, a pretty fair elections process in California, and it's made it much more partisan. Talk about maybe one or two of those that have been enacted in the past few years that you think will have a really negative and are having a really negative impact on the state.
Well, I'd say that one of the most fraud-prone bills, AB 1436 of FUOR back in 2012, now allows for same-day registration. That's going to be something that's completely new for the state of California. But more importantly, same-day registration without proof of residency. That means that it's going to become effective in 2017, but all the other states that have same-day registration require persons registering on election day provide some sort of identification to show that they actually live in the district, because the ballot can't be taken away once it goes into that ballot box. Under AB 1471, voters are going to be asked for the California driver's license or identification number or the last four digits of their social security number. But unlike other same-day registration dates, AB 1436 provides that if these numbers do not match the VoteCal or a federal database, the person will still be allowed to cast a vote. As a result, California's system will not be able to prevent persons using phony names and ID numbers, including non-residents, from registering and voting multiple times during the last 2 weeks of the election cycle. One of the bills I'm really concerned about is AB 1461 by Gonzalez-Fletcher that was passed in 2015. It would provide for automatic voter registration of people who simply visit the DMV. It requires the Secretary of State to automatically register to vote everyone who applies for a driver's license or ID card unless they affirmatively opt out. Persons who sign the application but do not respond to the question of whether they wish to register will therefore automatically be registered regardless of their citizenship status. And that's a big part of why I'm very concerned, is because I am not confident in the safeguards that this bill will register people who are not lawfully here in the United States.
You know, one of the most controversial bills that has attracted a lot of interest this year happened during the budget process, and arguably it was changing the rules to help one senator who's being targeted with the recall election right now. Talk about this bill and why you think it's such a bad precedent for the legislature to set.
So one of the things that happens when you actually impact election policy using a trailer bill is you actually get out of the whole sunshine and transparency process that we're supposed to have here in the state of California. Normally, a bill like that is going to be an urgency bill because it would take effect right away. Urgency bills require a 2/3 vote. By doing this, they actually ditch that requirement, making it only a majority requirement and signed by the governor. Because it's a part of the budget, it's going to take effect right away. So they've taken away that urgency bill requirements. They also bypass the hearings that would be very important by changing policy so much in the state of California. So they've basically made it so that the rules can be changed just to protect one of their own. And I would argue, as the legislature becomes more and more unpopular on both the right and the left, that they've made it easier to be an imperial legislature, if you will, making it more difficult for them to recall themselves. This is something that would have Governor Hiram Johnson, who founded the recall, the referendum, the initiative, all of the hallmarks of direct democracy in the state of California. He's just got to be spinning in his grave at this point.
Let's turn to an issue that's been a real priority for you, and that's increasing government transparency. You've introduced legislation this year that would increase the transparency in local bond measures. Talk about your bill and how it would benefit taxpayers.
Well, I'll tell you what, my bill, AB 776, initially would have required an estimate of the total expense of the bond and the cost of taxpayers in the ballot language. In the Assembly, the bill was actually watered down to require only that ballot language tell voters where they could find that cost in the voters' pamphlets. Not my ideal, but you got to do this in order to be able to get it forward and at least have some kind of reform, even though I would have not wanted the initial reform. AB 776 would have faced that death unless the amendments were passed. The backers of this change argued that the 75-word limit on ballot questions makes it difficult to explain the cost to taxpayers, but that's plainly untrue. Berkeley put a bond measure to the voters last November, and it stayed within those limits.
I know before that you came to the Assembly, you served for many years in the Huntington Beach Union High School District Board. And what experiences did you have at the school board level with bond measures and being transparent with voters about the projected costs for desired projects?
And I know I argued about transparency at the school bond at the local level when I was on the Huntington Beach Union High School District. And that's something that I felt very strongly about. Wasn't able to get it into the language that was presented onto the ballot, but nevertheless made sure it was part of the public discussion, how it was covered by our local newspapers, and how it was presented into the ballot arguments themselves, even if not into how it was placed on the actual ballot. And I think everybody has a potential role on this issue because every school bond, whether it's in any of the 1,000 plus school districts around the state of California, it's actually regular citizens that can participate in those ballot arguments for and against, and being influential in terms of how they're placed by their local school board.
It would seem that if school districts were able to would be able to build larger and more diverse coalitions to pass bond measures like these, if they were more transparent about the details, yet many districts wanted to keep this information in the dark. Why do you think that is? And wouldn't you think that local taxpayers would vote for a bond measure if they had all the information and the district made a compelling case?
I think that some people want bond measures to pass by any means necessary. But I think it's important to actually have it so that taxpayers and voters have the information to be able to make the right decisions for them and to be able to know what are the total costs and what are the total benefits. In Orange County, on the transportation side, Measure M is a part of our local transportation funding. Citizens have been able to see the benefits of that transportation improvements through freeways, through freeway interchanges, as well as other transportation projects, and that was renewed with a well over 2/3 vote. That's because there have been a tangible improvement in terms of what taxpayers see. In case of bonds, I think it should be the same way. They should be able to have it articulated. What are those bonds going to go for, and what are going to be the total cost for them in terms of their property tax increases going into the future?
So as we wind up here, I have two final questions for you. So first, I can't let you get away as two big USC Trojan grads and fans here. We have a pretty exciting football season coming up. You know, I think by all estimates, Trojan probably be a top 5 team, and we have our quarterback, the leading candidate for the Heisman Trophy. How does the 2017 Trojan football season look to you here at just before the start?
I think the prospects look good, and you've got an exciting schedule with Notre Dame as well as Texas to be played at the Coliseum, and so I think the team is doing outstanding. Some really great surprises with our coaching staff and doing really well. So I think the prospects are outstanding for a great season for USC Trojan football.
and fight on to all of our Trojan listeners here. And then finally, a question that we ask all of our guests here on Another Round. We call ourselves Another Round because California has such great wine, and all of the hosts of this podcast like to drink a lot of it. You're so blessed to represent one of the most beautiful parts of the state, somewhere everybody wants to go. So I'm going to let you play tour guide for your assembly district. When we come down to visit you, what are the must-visit either wineries or brew houses that visitors to your district should not be sure to miss?
Well, I'll tell you what, there's one place that probably would be considered near the top of the list. It's actually called The Winery. Now, I'll tell you, nobody really grows any grapes within the district. It's suburban Orange County with Irvine, Costa Mesa, and the coastal cities of Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, and Laguna Beach. But the winery is a place that's right on Pacific Coast Highway in Newport Beach. You can actually pull up in a Duffy boat or other small boat and dock up and be able to enjoy a lot of the food and the beverages that they have at that location. It's just beautiful.
Well, Assemblyman Harper, thank you so much for joining us on Another Round.
Thank you so much, Tim, and great to be able to talk with you today.
Great interview, Tim. This last segment we're calling Last Call, and it's a time where PRI team gives their thoughts on our guest interview. And in addition to Tim and Naya, there is Lance Izumi here with us today. Lance Izumi is Senior Director of Education Studies at PRI. And both Lance and Tim have spent nearly 2 decades in Sacramento. And I just want to also add that we're all proud Trojans. Lance got his law degree at USC. Tim got his master's, and I did my undergraduate degree. And back in the late 80s, I even saw a game with Marcus Allen.
When I went to USC, I went from 2002 to 2005. That was the last big heyday when they won the back-to-back national championships, despite what the BCS has to say and the NCAA. And it was funny, I resisted my fandom, but I saw Matt Leinart, who was the great Trojan quarterback at LAX once, and he was at the bookstore, and I resisted every urge in me to go over and talk to him. I think Assemblyman Harper is right. This is really an exciting season coming up. After the thrilling Trojan comeback victory over Penn State in the Rose Bowl, this is really the first time in the last decade, despite a lot of hope and a lot of seasons where the Trojans were ranked number 1 or in top 5 very early. There really is the nucleus here with Sam Darnold, who, is really, the leading contender to win the Heisman. There's really a good chance that if the Trojans play as I think they are, they can make the college football playoff, and then who knows from there.
Oh, I agree with that, Tim. It's interesting because, my background is that I actually did my undergraduate at UCLA across town. Oh, yeah. Yes, I know. So, when I went to USC for law school, I actually would tell people afterwards that I was actually a POW for 3 years at SC. So, despite the fact that I got my Juris Doctorate from SC Law School, I, would root for the Bruins. I still root for the Bruins, but, I would also root against USC. But I would say certainly over the last 10 years or so, I've softened up very much and have become a very pro-Trojan football fan as well. So, I do think that you're right. That Sam Darnold is the real deal. And, when you look at in the past, the Trojans had, large hopes with Matt Barkley and others, and that unfortunately they fizzled out. But having watched the Trojans last season and looked what an incredible turnaround that they had when Darnold came on the scene and was able to take control of that team, it was unbelievable. And so it's I think that the sky's the limit for him, and that I'd be surprised if the Trojans didn't actually go on and win the whole thing this coming year.
I'm looking forward to that. I hope that that is the case. I thought this was a very interesting episode of Another Round, because I know when you ask most people on the street, campaign and elections issues and elections process issues are not at the top of their agenda, and that probably, they have memories back to high school civics class and how kind of boring it is. But it really is very important, and how, fair elections really do chart the course of our state. And when I worked in the legislature, year after year, there were these different bills that would kind of chip away at fair elections in California. California historically has always been a leader and always had as a hallmark free, fair, and open election. And now our elections process has slowly become much more partisan. And it was always a challenge as a communications person. These bills are incredibly important, yet trying to get the average person to get interested in them and understand them is always a challenge, and especially to giving news media where there's fewer and fewer reporters covering Sacramento to focus on these bills is also a challenge. One bill that we've already seen play out that has already impacted the outcome of elections in California, I would argue. We changed a few years ago. Back in the day, you had to have your ballot into the county elections office by 8 o'clock when the polls closed on election day for it to count. And it didn't matter if it was postmarked and you got it late, or you didn't get around to turning it in, you filled it out early. You had to have it, into the elections office or at your local polling place by 8 on election day. And the legislature changed that to say, as long as it was postmarked by election day, if we received it up to 3 days after election day, it would still count. That change may seem benign. Oh, of course, it's convenient for voters and, the U.S. Postal Service isn't what it once was. But you kind of have visions when I saw that, I had visions of, Lyndon Johnson running for Senate in Texas in 1948 and picking out how many more votes do we need to stuff into the ballot box. And what you've really seen, there's a real potential for ballot harvesting with this type of change. And in this last election, I think you could argue one state Senate race in Orange County really was decided based on this law. You had in the 29th Senate District, Ling Chang, who was an assembly member, was running for Senate, and she was ahead once all the ballots were counted on election night. And as the week progressed, her lead grew narrower and narrower and narrower. And then when the flood of these votes and this new period came in, she actually ultimately narrowly lost the election. And in 2016, there was the anomaly that because Veterans Day fell on Friday, they actually had a few more days to receive the ballots. And I think you could argue that that period and that bill had the difference of changing who was elected. And really, I think it's very chilling that some of these changes are affecting now the outcome of elections, and it really shouldn't be at all. So I'm glad we had the chance to talk about these issues and hopefully raise the profile of some of them, because I think they're underreported but critically important for our state.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Tim. One of the other things that I thought that Assemblyman Harper brought up that is extremely important is the issue of transparency with regard to the school bonds that are being voted upon. It just seems like an avalanche of them every election cycle now. And I think that when these bond measures, these school construction bonds, for example, that are put before the public has this idea about what exactly they're voting on, and they think that okay, I'm voting to build more schools, more classrooms, and because of overcrowding or something like that. At least that's the argument that's made. But it turns out that in more than a few cases that school districts are using these bond monies for purposes that many voters would have scratched their heads about. So, for example, in Los Angeles Unified School District, these construction bond monies were used to pay for iPads for kids. And, that ended up being a huge disaster that cost, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And unfortunately, one of probably the worst fiscal decisions that the district ever made. And that was done using school construction money. Now, it is true that if you look at the law, it says that these school construction bond monies can be used in addition to capital projects, can be used for quote unquote technology. But I think voters in many cases will think that, well, that may mean hooking up the classroom with Wi-Fi or internet capabilities. And they don't realize that it's being used to pay for iPads for kids. And it's interesting that former longtime superintendent of Los Angeles Unified, a fellow named Bill Johnston, came out and said that he thought that what the LA Unified did with using that school bond money was illegal, and that these even under the best of circumstances, these iPads may have a lifespan of maybe 3 years or so, and yet the bond is over a 25-year period. And so do voters know that this is where their tax dollars go? I think the other thing that people should be aware of is that when they are told that, these bond monies are going to be under the oversight of independent bond oversight committees, that the recommendations of those committees are simply that. They're recommendations. They do not have to be followed by the school boards and the school districts. And so therefore, even if the bond oversight committee has problems with how that bond money is used, ultimately it's up to the politically elected school board members to decide how to use that money. And that, again, is problematical, especially when you see how LA Unified and other districts have used their monies.
Thanks, Lance. And it's a shame that Californians will be paying for those iPads long after they're obsolete. So thanks, Tim. Thanks, Lance. And thanks to our listeners for staying with us for Last Call. To stay up to date with Assemblyman Harper, follow him on Twitter at ASMHarper. And don't forget to follow PRI on Twitter at Pacific Research. If you like our podcast, please tell your friends and encourage them to subscribe in iTunes. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll be back again for another round with PRI.